I'm glad that Elka mentioned a book that Müge and I published some years ago called A Question of Genocide, Armenians and Turks at the End of the Ottoman Empire. Some people, particularly Armenians, have criticized us for using that title, A Question of Genocide. I thought it was clear that we were using it in the double entendre, the dual meaning of a matter of genocide, and that some people are questioning whether it was a genocide. I would say that today's talk basically is an answer to the question, a question of genocide. The story I want to tell you tonight is a story of why, when, and how the genocide of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire happened. The story is a story of a moment of historical passage when empires attempted to accommodate themselves to a transforming world, a world in which nations and national states were challenging the very sources of power and legitimacy of imperial regimes. Yet, we often forget that in that period of the early 20th century, those empires were not ready to give up or to go away or to give in. They were not prepared to surrender to what later would appear to be irresistible pressures of nationalism, power, popular empowerment, and regimes based on equality and merit rather than on inherited privilege and hierarchy. Looking back from our own time, from the future, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of subject nations appear to be historically inevitable. But for the actors of that time, of the last decades of the 19th and the early 20th century, that was not the only road that could have been taken. My talk, actually, and the book on which it is based here, which is available on Amazon, about $30, not much, that book and that argument today is about matters of choice, moments of decision, when political actors might have acted differently, but decided instead to embark on a course that led to devastation and destruction even of their own empire. Now, as historians in the room know, and possibly everyone understands, the recovery of a difficult past is a challenge to those we might call assassins of memory. To those who would, through distorting sophistries, deny or minimize the enormity of human tragedy. Now, we know that nations and nation-states have long been in the business of fabricating, sometimes more honestly than at other times, myths and stories of their origins, their golden ages, heroic deeds, victories and triumphs, while eliminating the blemishes of defeats and failures, even mass murders. Except perhaps in Germany, where they do recognize what happened in the past, and they live with that legacy, especially if you spend time in Berlin, almost on a daily basis. But for most countries, what appears to be new in our own times is the brazenness, the boldness, the shamelessness of what is claimed, the blatant cynicism of the perpetrators, and the potential reach through mass print and broadcast media, film, and the internet. Lies and mythologies seem to be in the air. By the way, I'm talking about the genocide and Ottoman Turkey, not about the current American political campaign. Historians, of course, inevitably are pulled into this war of images and words. And the only weapon we have against bad history deployed for political or personal vindication is scrupulous investigation that results in evidence-based narration and analysis of what it is possible to know. But we can take some good feeling, some sense of the rightness of what we're doing, because the proliferation of usable pasts and preferred realities can be very dangerous. We can take some comfort in the thought that dangers lurk when intellectual constructs stray too far from careful and accurate readings of the world. Reality, in other words, has a nasty habit of biting back. In the case of the Ottoman the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the last decades, and the Armenian Genocide, revision of history has been constant and been highly controversial. But in this case of the Armenian Genocide, we have two basic narratives. One is largely identified with the Turkish state, and a few less than scrupulous historians, I hesitate to call them scholars, who have rejected the notion of genocide and have argued either that there were no deliberate mass killings or that the tragedy was the result of a reasonable and understandable response of a government to a rebellious and seditious population in time of war and mortal danger to the state's survival. In a more sophisticated version, what might now be called neo-denialism, raison d'état, fancy French for reason of state, justified the suppression of rebellion, and mass killing is explained as the unfortunate residue, or what in my country is called collateral damage, of legitimate efforts to establish order behind the lines. In other words, in this denialist account, you might summarize the position as something like this. There was no genocide, and the Armenians are to blame for it. They were rebellious, treacherous subjects who presented an immediate and palpable danger to the empire, and they got what they deserved. Relative peace and harmony had existed in the Ottoman Empire, which was surprisingly tolerant between the state and religious minorities until outside agitators, usually from the Russian Empire, but sometimes American or German and Protestant missionaries, aroused the nationalist and separatist passions of the Armenians. Still, say these denialists, despite the existential threat posed by the Armenians and their Russian allies to the survival of the empire, there was no intention or effort by the Young Turk regime to eliminate the Armenians as a people. Therefore, genocide is not an appropriate word. Now, on the other side, there's a counter-narrative that's developed and is now accepted by the majority of historians, which does accept 1915 as a genocide, as a state-organized, initiated, and carried out attempt to eliminate or render impotent a cultural, racial, national, ethnic, or religious group, namely the Armenian people. But I want to say tonight that many people sympathetic to that view, particularly Armenians, publicists, and historians, have sometimes shied away from explanations that might place any blame at all on the victims of Turkish policies. Because a nuanced account of the background and causes of the genocide seem to concede ground to the deniers, Armenian scholars, in particular, have been reluctant to see any rationale in the acts of the Young Turks. And I've been told this by scholars, and indeed much of my work has been criticized by Armenians precisely because they will say to me, if you try to explain, you will rationalize what they did, and rationalization will lead to justification. But I say to them, if you leave out explanation, what do you actually offer? You are probably making some kind of essentialist argument. So you don't have to explain this genocide. It was done by Turks. Turks are those kind of people who employ massacre and genocide, mass killing, to maintain their imperial dominance. Or you might go a little more sophisticatedly to related arguments that actually it's deep, indelible cultural characteristics, religion, Islam, or ethnicity, Turkish culture, that are really the underlying causes of the killing. And I would say that the most insidious arguments are those like those, say, of the very prominent and important Islamic scholar Bernard Lewis of Princeton, who spoke of a conflict of two nationalist movements, Turkish and Armenian, over a single contested area, namely Eastern Anatolia, historic Armenia, and then treat this genocide as if it was a conflict between two religious communities without understanding the hierarchy of power, the inequivalence of power between the state actors and the Muslims and the Armenians and their communities. Now, I won't go as far to say that ethnicity and religion are not part of the story, certainly as markers of who would be distinguished as the victims. They contributed to singling out those who were marked for destruction. But I would argue that you cannot limit your explanation to some kind of inevitable struggle built on these differences. In other words, like many political scientists, I do not believe that difference inevitably leads to conflict, and conflict inevitably leads to violence, and that violence must degenerate or metastasize into something like mass killing or genocide. So if I'm eliminating or putting aside or trying to nuance these kinds of explanations, what is my argument? Let me up front tell you what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue, first of all, that the Young Turks, whatever else they were not purely Turkish ethno-nationalists. They were not Kemalists avant la lettre. They were never religious fanatics, but essentially remained Ottoman reformers, one might say modernizers, in their fundamental self-conception. The Young Turks were primarily state imperialists, empire preservers rather than founders of an ethnic nation-state. There was no thought of giving up, for instance, the Arab lands, Palestine, or Iraq, what would be Iraq today, Mesopotamia, that they still controlled, or even to eliminate totally their Christian and Jewish subjects. And when the opportunity arose in 1918, the Young Turks were prepared to move north and east into Russian Caucasia to create buffer states using other Muslim and even non-Muslim peoples. On the other hand, over time, the Young Turks, who when they came to power in 1908 were Ottomanists, restoring the constitution and the idea of the Tanzimat, over time, these Young Turks came to believe that Muslims, particularly Turks, were the appropriate people to rule the empire. That Muslims, particularly Turks, were the most trustworthy supporters of the Ottoman state, and therefore, increasingly, they convinced themselves that egalitarian Ottomanism was a political fantasy. Their empire would be an empire, but it would be more Islamic, more Turkic, but still multicultural, marked by religious and ethnic differentiation, with some people more equal than others. Now, I want to understand very briefly that I see empire and nation-state as two opposite ends of a political spectrum. The former, nation or nation-state, is basically about the homogenization of all members of the polity, as much as possible, at least in its Weberian ideal type, and the establishment of equality of all citizens. It's a kind of horizontal equivalence, at least before the law, if not always in practice. The latter, empire, is about institutionalized difference and equality, or what one graduate student wisely told me, a practice of inequality. A ruling elite or people dominating their subordinates, their rule justified by conquest, divine sanction, their inherent superiority over their subjects, or a civilizing mission. Confronted by the mobilizing efficiencies of new nation-states of Western Europe, both the Russian and the Ottoman states, Ottoman empires, were determined in the 19th and early 20th centuries to reform, that is, to modernize, to nationalize, as far as possible, the empire, to make it at some points more civilly unified and coherent, more Rossiyski, that is, inclusive of all the Tsar's subjects, or Osmanlı, Ottoman rather than ethnic Turkish, And at other times, they even experimented with being more ethnically homogeneous, more Ruski, say under Alexander III, ethnically Russian, or Turk, ethnically Turkish, as in the late Young Turk period. But those efforts of ethnic homogenization were haphazard, sporadic, and ultimately futile. And in neither case, Ottoman or Russian, was there a clear or even feasible program of creating an ethno-national state like France or the Kemalist Turkish Republic. I would add, however, that if you accept my view that these were empire preservers, empire savers, following that formulation, it becomes clearer that rather than ethno-national nation building, the effort in 1915, that is the genocide, is better described as a colonial project. And indeed, it involved both ethnic cleansing and getting rid of the inhabitants, that is ethnic cleansing, because you want the land, you want the resources, and you want the property. And secondly, it also involved the resettlement of Muslim refugees in the formerly Armenian villages and towns. That is the colonization, the settlement by Muslims of Anatolia. Now, whether Adolf Hitler actually used the phrase, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" and there's much controversy over that, significantly, that very speech, which was given to his comrades as an exhortation in 1939 to be as ruthless as necessary in their war against Poland, which of course was the first step in the creation of Lebensraum, a campaign that historians David Osuaga and Kasper Eriksson have called the greatest colonial war in history. That analogy with what happened in the Ottoman Empire, it seems to me, is quite telling. So the Young Turks then, in my view, were about creating imperial nations within their empires. The empire would continue. It would be multinational, but in a new form appropriate for the modern age. A succession of modernizing efforts followed one another in the late Ottoman period. The Western-oriented Tanzimat, the Hamidian Islamic coalition, and then the Young Turks' initial constitutionalism that ultimately degenerated into absolutism. These different efforts followed one another. And non-Turks, like the Armenians and the Assyrians, the Greeks and the Jews, had to struggle to find their own place within a tremulous political landscape. So I'm trying to take the late Ottoman period out of a kind of inevitabilistic, organic, nationalist narrative that reads back the origins of the Kemalist state into earlier centuries. And instead of looking from the present into the past, which of course is important since the removal of the Armenians and later the exchange of the Greeks with Muslims in the Balkans, did lay the basis for the creation of the Kemalist state. I want instead to recreate this period of 1914, 15, and 16 in which the genocide took place without reading it into the future. So first let me tell you something about the genocide itself. I won't actually spend a lot of time with it. I will rather look at the causes and try to give an explanation. But we need to know something so that we start together. Before 1915, there were something like 2 million, perhaps 2.5 million Armenians who lived in the Ottoman lands. Most of them were peasants, townspeople too. In the Anatolian population, estimated to be between 15 and 17.5 million inhabitants, Armenians were outnumbered by their Muslim neighbors almost everywhere. Occasionally, there would be villages of Armenians or parts of cities which were Armenian. Only in the city of Van in eastern Turkey were the Armenians a plurality, perhaps even a close majority. A few Armenians, the minority of Armenians, lived in Istanbul, but they were the most influential and prosperous. And their very visibility, their wealth, their closeness to the Ottoman court, they were the owners of the mint, the emperor's architects, the Balyan family, these kinds of people. This kind of visibility of this small bourgeois group made them the target of both official and popular resentment from many Muslims. And that image of Armenians, this bourgeois image, not unlike that of Jews in Eastern Europe, came to characterize Armenians more generally. But really what came to be called the first genocide in or near Europe in the 20th century was actually due largely to the aspirations of a small group of progressive politicians, the Committee of Union and Progress, or the Young Turks. And it's their radicalization of their intentions and the final implementation of their plans which occurred in the context of a deepening social and political crisis that led to the mass killing. Now, I can list to you dozens of causes, and historians love causes. We throw lots of causes, and that's how we solve problems sometimes. But unfortunately, I spent 11 years in a political science department at the University of Chicago, and we look for what's called parsimony, to try to see out of this mass of possibilities, the context which we historians are so sensitive to are the main ingredients. I could talk about the international situation, the role of Britain and Russia in trying to impose reforms on the Ottoman state, which created other kinds of resentments, or the territorial losses of the Ottomans in North Africa, or in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, or the imposed reform by the European powers in 1914 that would have given European Christian governors, or let's say inspectors, to the eastern provinces, the so-called Armenian provinces. There are many of those kinds of causes. But what I want to emphasize in my own explanation is the mentality, the worldview of the Young Turks themselves and why they would turn to these events. First, I should mention that most of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, the ones that I've been talking about, this is an earlier view of Armenians. This is about what they looked like on the eve of the war. Most Ottoman Armenians, from my research, it's clear, supported and even fought alongside the Ottomans against the Russians, while Armenians in Russia organized in volunteer units and joined the Tsarist campaign. In other words, the idea of Armenians organized as a rebellious population itself needs to be challenged. It's a part of the mythology of denialism. And yet, within the worldview of the Young Turks, there's a way in which violence was inscribed, particularly in the views of Enver, Jamal, and Talat Pasha, the three who came to power in January 1913 in a coup d'etat. They were convinced that politics was a kind of warfare, and those who stood in their way, whether ministers, journalists, dissenters, had to be removed by force. Early in the Great War, in late 1914 and early 1915, massacres of Christians, already Armenians and Assyrians, and massacres of Muslims were occurring along the frontier between Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. The catalytic event that would change a certain kind of mentality into mass killing occurred, in my view, early in 1915, when the Ottomans lost a major battle on the Caucasian front to the Russians at Sarikamish. And after this, even though this disastrous battle loss, in which some 45,000 Ottomans were killed, was largely the result of Enver Pasha's poor generalship, the Turks attributed that loss to Armenian treachery. It should be mentioned that thousands of Armenian soldiers were in the Ottoman army at the time, having been mobilized by the Armenian political parties, most importantly the leading political party, the Dashnag Sutyun, and many died in this battle. But after that loss, in late February, early March 1915, the Young Turk government, led by Talat, Enver, and Jamal, ordered the disarming of Armenian soldiers and their transfer into labor battalions, Amele Tabular. The first victims of the state were these demobilized Armenian soldiers, who were easily segregated and then systematically killed. Thus, the muscle of the Armenian communities was removed. Almost immediately, the government then ordered the deportation of Armenians from cities, towns, and villages in the east, ostensibly as a military measure to ensure the security of the rear. Soon, Armenians throughout the country were being marched through the mountains into the deserts of Mesopotamia. This exodus of Armenians was haphazard and brutal. Irregular forces, local Kurds and Circassians, Teshkilat Masusa, also cut down hundreds of thousands of Christians as civil and military officials oversaw and facilitated the removal of the empire's Armenian subjects. Some Armenians, seeing the encroaching disaster, began to resist, only in about 4 or 5 places, in the city of Van, in Musadagh, in Sassoon, and elsewhere. Because of that resistance at Van, the Young Turks ordered on April 24th, 1915, the removal of the Armenian intellectuals from Istanbul, the arrest of about 300 or 400 important figures, including deputies of the Ottoman parliament, like Krikor Zorab. They were marched out of the city. Eventually, most of them were killed as well. April 24th is, of course, the date that Armenians and others commemorate the genocide. Most of the people sent on these marches perished either on the marches or in the deserts of Mesopotamia, in places like Deir Zor or Raqqa in the deserts, places you know from the news now occupied by ISIS. In 1916, after the large killing was over, more killing took place in the camps in Mesopotamia. I want to emphasize that 1915 was a gendered genocide. Men died in greater numbers. Many women and children were taken into the families of local Muslims. Tens of thousands of orphans found some refuge in the protection of Armenian missionaries. By the end of the war, the Armenian community, which was largely a religious community, ethno-religious community, largely under the hegemony of their clergy or of intellectuals, this community was almost totally eliminated. 90% of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire were gone, a culture and civilization never to return. It's estimated conservatively that between 800,000 and 1 million and more were slaughtered or died on the marches. Other tens of thousands fled to the north, to Caucasia, to Russia. But I should also mention that hundreds of thousands of women and children survived. They were compelled to convert to Islam. They survived in families of Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, sometimes as servants or slaves, sometimes as wives and mothers. Today, indeed, in Turkey, we estimate hundreds of thousands of Kurds or Turks actually have Armenian ancestries. And just a few years ago at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, we had a conference on Islamicized Armenians. Those who observed these killings, as well as the Allied powers engaged in a war against the Ottomans, repeatedly claimed that they had never witnessed anything like it. Indeed, the word had not yet been invented to describe what happened. In May 1915, for the first time in an international document, the Allies used the term crimes against humanity and held the Young Turks responsible. But that word genocide had yet to come. There was no concept yet to mark the state-targeted killing of a designated ethno-religious people. And so at the time, those who needed a word borrowed it from the Bible, and it was called Holocaust. My great-grandparents were among the victims. Now, how do I explain, indeed, what happened? I would like to argue that one has to look at the mentality of those who carried out the killing. Instead of piling explanations on, see what mentality was formulated by those events, by that context. And so what I want to explain is what I've called the affective disposition of the Young Turks, the emotional disposition, the emotional and cognitive universe in which the Young Turks could imagine that they faced an existential threat from their Armenian and Assyrian subjects, and thus were required, felt it was imperative to disperse, assimilate, or murder hundreds of thousands of them. So I'm using the term disposition here to mean a tendency or a proclivity to think or act in a certain way under certain circumstances. I'm thinking of it as a collection of preferences and beliefs and attitudes, habits of mind, and their associated feelings and emotions that would lead people and groups to certain kinds of actions under certain circumstances. There are other terms that people use also to sort of get close to this idea of affective disposition. You could call ideology, belief, Weltanschauung. You could call it habitus, to use the Bourdieuian term. But I use affective disposition because I think there's a very interesting mix of emotional attitudes and cognitive understandings that blend together to make it more likely to act in this way than in that. And sometimes I use the example of a glass of water. Let's say this was not plastic, but a beautiful crystal goblet. And it would have, if I put it on the table, a disposition of brittleness. It's okay if it sits there. But if I suddenly slam the glass and it crashes to the floor, it will shatter. So it has a possibility, a proclivity to be shattered. But some catalytic event is necessary to take that emotional understanding, that cognitive view of the world, that heuristic that has described Armenians in a certain way, and lead to mass killing. So the book itself, in some ways, is an attempt to understand and the various ingredients that went into this affective disposition that made this possible. Largely on the elite level, largely among, starting with Abdul Hamid II, who you're looking at and who's looking at you from here, and later to the Young Turks, as well as try to understand how this filtered down and was created in everyday life among ordinary people. My own argument is that the first instances that I could find of this affective disposition are actually in the words and writings of the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who came to the throne in the 1870s and ruled right up till 1909. Abdul Hamid is most important because he brings the Tanzimat, in some sense, to an end, that reform period, that Ottomanist period of equality between different millets, different religious communities, and instead decided to bank on an alliance between the Kurds and the Turks. By forming regiments, not unlike Cossack regiments in the east, the so-called Hamidiya regiments, which would then patrol eastern Anatolia, keep the border with Iran safe, and keep the Armenians in their place. But in that empire, that after 1878, because of the loss of the Balkan lands, had become more and more Muslim, and more located in Asia than in Europe, this conservative state ideology only caused more problems. The Kurds, actually, had been more of a threat to Ottoman unity and peace than Armenians in the 19th century. Almost every decade, there's a revolt of Kurds. And yet Abdul Hamid for his own reasons, backed those elements and linked the Armenians as a danger, most importantly, because the Armenians were Christians and therefore tied and favored, particularly by the two great empires, the British and the Russians. So they were an internal population connected to external threats. In this way, Abdul Hamid managed to secure Kurdish loyalty and at the same time to extend and create a force that could keep Armenians in their place. Armenians, on the other hand, themselves resisted this new turn and formed indeed revolutionary parties, actually quite small in number, but whose reputation and repute was greatly exaggerated. Here's this group, Freedom and Death, pretty fearsome guys, as you can see. Andranik, who was himself an Ottoman Armenian, one of the leaders of these groups. And they tried to resist. It's very interesting to read the history of the Armenian attempts to create this movement. One of the things you find, and Elke has found this, Elke Hartmann in her own work, is how difficult it was for the Armenian revolutionaries to organize people. There was actually resistance. Ordinary Armenians sometimes aided them, saw them as defenders, often didn't want them around because they only provoked the Turks or the Kurds to come in. And through much of the literature, you find them complaining of the difficulty to imbue these Armenians with a kind of nationalist view rather than some kind of Ottomanist view or local view or let us just live on our own kind of view. And yet this becomes part of the Armenian national tradition, the importance of these people. But what actually occurred instead of peace in eastern Anatolia were the horrendous Hamidian massacres of the 1890s, 1894 to 1896. Now, these massacres have often been taken as the first instance of genocide by many historians. In my own work, what I try to do is disaggregate different moments of mass killing. The Hamidian massacres, which were, whether ordered directly by Abdul Hamid, in fact allowed to go on and even praised at some points, these massacres were in some ways a kind of prophylactic. They were an attempt by the regime to keep Armenians in their place, not to eliminate them as a people. So this was mass killing, something like 300,000 Armenians may have lost their lives. My mother's mother fled to America after these massacres from Diyarbakir, but in fact was not the kind of revolutionary, genocidal cleansing of 1915. It was often caused by local resentments, by fears of rebellion, by a reaction to Armenian revolutionaries themselves. In a kind of peculiarly toxic mix, religion, anxiety about class status, feeling that the Armenians are doing better than us, but they're not Muslims, they're heretics. Why should they be doing better? And a general insecurity about the kinds of changes that were taking place in the empire. These things together combine to create the kind of fear that you would find in that moment. In 1908, of course, this is a quick run through Ottoman history, late Ottoman history. In 1908, the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan, took power, not absolutely. It would take another year before they would actually get rid of the emperor, of the Sultan, but they proclaimed a constitution. And people greeted this extremely enthusiastically, particularly non-Turks as well. Armenians, Greeks, and Jews were happy about the restoration of the constitution. They greeted the restoration. They were hopeful that the new government would provide a political mechanism through the parliament for peaceful development within the framework of representation. Society woke up. Newspapers were developed. You could say that a real public sphere, in the Habermasian term, came into power in Russia, in the Turkish Empire. Women began to be educated in new ways. Concerts were held, theaters, church bells were read. Armenians marched in demonstrations. Armenians and non-Muslims were allowed to carry arms. But the irony is that this public sphere, as Bedros Matosyan has shown, in fact created new anxieties, because now people who had been less visible were ever more visible. And importantly, at this moment, the Dashnag Suchun, the leading political party, and it would be followed by the other Armenian parties, gave up their revolutionary organizations. They disarmed their Fedai bands. They gave up underground activity in both constitutionalist Turkey and Iran. They even closed down an influential journal in France called Pro-Armenia, which promoted the Armenian cause in Europe. The Dashnags and other political parties were committed to this parliamentary regime. In September 1908, the Dashnags officially recognized the territorial integrity of the empire, but they also called for the administrative autonomy of Eastern Anatolia, of the Armenian regions. They wanted somehow to work within the regime, but to have some kind of degree of self-rule, of protection from the Kurds and other predators in their region. And that was anathema to the Young Turks, who favored a much more unified idea, a less federalist idea that the Ottomanists had held and continued to hold at that time. The Young Turks actually looked for ways to work with the Armenians, and indeed they ran joint party lists in the elections right up to 1912. But in 1909, suddenly, partly as a result of this new visibility of the Armenians and the fears and anxieties to which it gave rise, Turks and other Muslims in the city of Adana, in Cilicia, in the east, revolted and carried out a pogrom in the province of Adana, in which some 20,000 Armenians lost their lives. Now again, this event, 1909, has also been subsumed into a grand narrative that this was yet another event, like 1890 Hamidian massacres that were leading up to the genocide. But if you actually look at this event closely, this event, 1909, is a kind of urban riot that turns into a pogrom, to use the originally Russian word, against Armenians. Again, often organized by people of nationalist hue, but local and eventually put down. So these events, 1890s, 1909, in my view, are quite distinct and should not be integrated into a single narrative, which then, of course, makes the Turks essentially killers of Armenians. But something else was developing in this period, and that is that in this period, the Young Turks themselves, and much of the Turkish population, particularly in Istanbul and Izmir, Trabzon, and some other of the bigger cities, was becoming more anti-Christian, more anti-Greek originally, and more anti-Armenian. And these sentiments begin to develop in a very ugly way, particularly in the period around 1912, 1913. That is, the period of the Balkan Wars, when the Ottoman Turks, the Ottomans, lose much of their foothold in the Balkans. Several things about the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, in many ways, from its origins, was a Balkan empire, much more than an Anatolian empire. The Balkans were conquered before Anatolia, and Anatolia was thought of not so much as the homeland of the Turks, that would become a mythology later, but as a backwater area. Secondly, the Young Turks themselves, many of them, leaders like Talat and Enver, and later even Kemal Ataturk, came from the Balkans, from Salonika, from Macedonia. And so much of their experience in the Balkans and during this war would in fact color their attitudes toward what is likely to happen in the last foothold of the Ottoman Empire, namely Anatolia. And then a third point that should be made about these wars is hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million, Ottoman Muslims were forced to leave Greece and Bulgaria and Serbia and other parts of the Balkans. And where did they move? They moved to Anatolia, where they were then competitors for land and property with Armenians and others. But let me just take a moment to look at what some of these young Turk leaders felt and expressed at the moment of loss in the Balkan Wars. The influential Committee of Union and Progress member, Dr. Nazim, reported that the British consul in Izmir, reported to the British consul in Izmir that the nation, as he called it, was filled with the sentiment of hatred. Despair, that is the loss of hope in the future, colored the emotional world of the defeated. And loss was mixed with an urge to commit revenge of some kind. I quote now from a young witness of that time. I watched the fall of a vast empire, like the collapse of an old mansion, without comprehending a thing, moaning with great suffering, as if I'd been caught under its wreck. A nation was disintegrating, sinking into the darkness of history. All we could do was protest to no avail, sing bitter marches, and shout, vengeance, vengeance, unquote. Another organizer of the genocide, Bahadrin Shakir, cried for lost pieces of the fatherland, for the army that has lost its honor, I'm quoting here, for the Muslim Turkish populace trodden over by the enemy, and for our virtues that have become stained, unquote. Enver Pasha, in this picture in the front there, Enver Pasha was disoriented by the expulsion, I'm quoting now from Enver, a letter to his wife, our leaving these plains and plateaus, irritated by the blood of our ancestors. And he lamented that, I quote again, to leave to yesterday's servants those open spaces where the Turkish frontier warriors once rode their horses, to depart from our mosques, tombs, religious lodges, bridges, and castles. To be expelled from the Balkans into Anatolia is something a person cannot bear. I am willing to give the rest of my life in order to get vengeance from the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Montenegrins. Talat, his wife reports, cried for the first time in her memory as on the saddest day of his life when Adrianople, Edirne, fell to the enemy. Oh my God, writes one veteran, this is such a terrible, bitter, irreversible decline. My whole spirit, my entire being screams, vengeance, vengeance. If there is not an iota of affection in the heart of the century to be moved and saddened by the blood and cruelty, pity be upon us Turks, as Ottomans, if we do not scream, vengeance, vengeance. Those sentiments then appear, and Doğan Çetin showed this beautifully in his own work, in pamphlets and in cartoons that then are spread out into the larger population. This is part of that generation of what I've called an affective disposition, which only in 1914, here's Talat Pasha, the actual architect of the genocide. In 1914, it crystallizes when the great powers forced the Turks to accept the reform of 1914, in which these Christian inspectors will be placed in the eastern Anatolian provinces, which is something unbearable to the Ottoman government. And then, disastrously, perhaps fortuitously, the Great War broke out. Now, this war would be a catastrophe for the Ottomans. Of the more than 20 million subjects of the Sultan, perhaps as many as 5 million would perish as a consequence of the Young Turks' decision to join for what for them was a war of choice rather than a war of necessity. Most of the victims of that war in the Ottoman Empire were civilians. 18% of Anatolian Muslims would die, the casualties of battle, famine, disease, and governmental disorganization. About 90% of Armenians would be gone by the end of the war, deported, massacred, forcibly converted to Islam, or exiled beyond the borders of the new Turkey. The Young Turks, of course, entered the war to enhance their empire, only to preside over its demise. And of course, this war would lay the foundation for the national republic that would emerge. Interestingly enough, the Young Turks tried to deal with both sides in the conflict. They actually negotiated first with the Germans and secured an alliance with the Germans. And yet, rather perfidiously, after signing that alliance, Talat Pasha went to the Crimea, met with Nicholas II, the emperor, and Sazonov, the foreign minister, and said, we'll agree with you guys. We'll leave our German alliance if you will give up on the reform that you've imposed on us. The Russians refused, and the German alliance stayed intact. It's that possibility that the Germans would look the other way, that though they were receiving reports of what was actually going on in Eastern Anatolia, and those reports were sent to von Wangenheim, the ambassador in Istanbul, who then conveyed reports on to Beckmann Hollweg and the Kaiser, that they were neglected, they were rejected. It was clear that in Berlin, they were not going to turn on their Turkish allies. I do want to tell one story, because we're in Munich, and you may indeed know this story well. There was a German vice consul, a young officer named Max von Schöbner-Richter, who reported from the front, from Erzurum, where he was stationed, on what was happening. At first, Max, I'll call him that since von Schöbner-Richter is not easy for an Armenian American to say, Max reported that this was a necessity of war. But over time, he became convinced that this was in fact mass killing to rid the empire of Armenians. He even went to Kamil Pasha, the head general of the Eastern Front, to complain about it, but was turned away. He reported to the embassy, and yet nothing was done. This Max von Schöbner-Richter, later after the war, came to Munich, joined a small political party, the Nazi party, and was marching here on Odeonsplatz in 1923, arm in arm with Adolf Hitler. The first volley shot at the demonstrators hit Max in the lung. He fell, pulling Hitler down with him, dislocating Hitler's shoulder. The second volley went over Hitler's head. He was one of the first martyrs of Nazism. So somehow, if we have doubts about whether Adolf Hitler knew about what had happened in Anatolia in 1915, this story might give us some pause. Let me conclude then. What I have been arguing here is that in order to understand genocide, one has to understand how indeed an affective disposition, a view of the Armenians as an existential threat, was generated over time. I've given you only a sketch of this story. Certainly the war and the social disintegration, the invasion of the Russians and the British, and the defection of some Armenians to the Russian side moved the leaders of the Ottoman state to embark on what might be called radical securitization and social engineering, the massive deportation and massacre of hundreds of thousands of their Armenian and Assyrian subjects. The Young Turk ideologue himself, a Kurd, Ziya Gökalp, like so many others who saw genocide as necessary and even forced on the Ottomans, wrote with confidence, quote, "There was no Armenian massacre, there was a Turkish-Armenian arrangement. They stabbed us in the back, and we stabbed them back." In other words, what was done had to be done in the name of national security, and so was declared a kind of lawful lawlessness in the empire. The story I've been trying to tell you is that the genocide was neither religiously motivated nor a struggle between two contending nationalisms, one of which destroyed the other, but rather was the pathological response of desperate leaders who sought security against a people that they had imagined and constructed as enemies and driven into radical opposition to the regime under which they had lived for centuries. I would not argue, therefore, that the choice of genocide was inevitable. It was a choice made within a pathological, a perverse, affective disposition. What to denialists and their sympathizers appears to be a rational and justified strategic choice to eliminate a rebellious and seditious population, in my account, presented here, is the outcome of the Young Turks' construction, incorrectly, of the Armenian enemy. The actions that the Young Turks decided upon were based in this emotional predisposition that led to distorted interpretations of social reality and exaggerated estimations of threat. Threat is often anxiety about the future. It's not the actuality of the danger, but what you may expect in the future. The conviction that Armenians desired to form an independent state was a fantasy of the Young Turks, as well as a fantasy of a few Armenian extremists. The great majority of the Armenians, and this was one of the findings that was most startling to me, was that they were willing to live within the Ottoman Empire if their lives and property could be secured. And they hoped, therefore, for some help and protection from Europe. They clung to a belief, much longer than should have been expected, that a future was possible within the empire. These people had been socialized as Ottomans. This was their home. This is what they knew. And only when their own government turned against them, turned them into pariahs, did some of them defect or resist. The Armenian Genocide, along with the killing of Assyrians and the expulsion of the Greeks later, laid the ground, as I mentioned, for the more homogeneous nation-state that arose from the ashes of the empire. The genocide, in other words, and this is why it's so difficult for Erdogan and the Turkish government today to recognize it, was the foundational crime on which the present republic lies. But let's not be smug, especially Americans, because like so many other states, like Australia, Israel, the United States, the emergence of the Republic of Turkey involved the removal and the subordination of native peoples who had lived on that territory prior to its founding. There's a kind of perverse connection between ethnic cleansing, removal of people but not necessarily killing them, or genocide, mass killing to eliminate them as a people. There's a perverse connection between ethnic cleansing and genocide and the legitimacy of the national state. And it's maybe that fearfulness about that founding of the state that underlies the desperate efforts to deny or distort the history of the nation and the state's genesis. But I want to be hopeful in my last sentence that maybe for us as historians, as thinking citizens, if we try, as Germans have done so well, come to terms with that history, maybe that can have a salutary effect of questioning continued policies of ethnic homogenization and the refusal to recognize the claims and rights of those peoples, minorities or diasporas, Aborigines, Native Americans, Kurds, Palestinians, Assyrians or Armenians, people who refuse to disappear. Thank you.